Hi, hello, how are you? As a general principle, as a health principle, I think we can all agree that eating Twinkies is not good for you, or cake, or a wide variety of other sugary substances, and yet we all occasionally succumb to the desire to eat those things that we know just aren't any good for us. The same principle applies to the way that I listen to online preachers. Oftentimes I know it's not good for me, but I do it anyway, just to kind of see what people are saying out there. So I was dialing around YouTube the other day, and I came across a preacher, charismatic guy, I'm guessing. Oh, and he was carrying on and stomping and fuming and really genuinely acting the fool. And he was acting the fool on purpose, and he justified his behavior by Paul's writing in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. And he took out of that context the phrase, the foolishness of preaching. That's the way the King James renders it, the foolishness of preaching. And so he read that as preaching should be foolish. And he was purposefully acting foolish because he thought that that somehow enhanced his preaching. And of course, that's a terrible misreading of what Paul actually wrote. Here's what he said. Let's start reading 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. It says, "The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So essentially what Paul's getting at is that the cross itself, the preaching of the cross, the proclamation of the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross, and that being fully sufficient for our complete salvation, is foolish to people who aren't being saved, who aren't in that process of a sovereign God drawing them to himself. In other words, they see Christianity generally as being silliness, as being foolishness. But it's because, well, they're not being saved. That's what Paul said. The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Hold on to that idea. It is the dunamis. It is the very power of God through which he does miracles, through which he saves people, through which Christ came to the planet. So remember the power of God. Very important phrase. "For it's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the understanding of those who have understanding I will confound." So where is the wise person? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God, God was pleased through the foolishness of preaching to save those who believe. Now, the NASB renders that God was pleased through the foolishness of the message that is preached. And that's because the Greek word for preaching is actually keruso, but the particular Greek word that Paul used here includes the content of the message that's being proclaimed, and that is why the NASB went with, it is the foolishness of the message preached. It's not just the message, it's the proclamation of the message and the content of the message. And so it pleased God, since the world, through their own wisdom, through their worldly wisdom, they didn't come to understand the things of God. They couldn't figure out God by the standard techniques that people use to accumulate knowledge here on the planet. You can't figure God out that way. Instead, he had to reveal himself, and he's doing that not only through preaching, but through the message itself that is being preached. Well, so he says, "For since in the wisdom of God, It was God's idea, God's wisdom. The world, through its own wisdom, did not come to know God, so the lack of understanding by the world was by God's design. But God was pleased through the foolishness, not because the message itself is foolish or preaching itself is foolish, but because the world sees it as foolish. That's how he began this whole thing. The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. So through that thing that they think is foolish, the preaching of the gospel, the message that is preached, through their perception of that being foolish, that's the way that God is saving people who do believe. The people who come to faith in Jesus Christ, they do it despite the fact that the world thinks that's just foolish. So in context, you can see that Paul is not saying that preaching needs to be folly, that it needs to be foolish. What he's saying is the world considers the message of Christ to be foolish. Verse 22 then, for indeed Jews ask for signs, that's what they require in order to believe, and the Greeks search for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, that's a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles, that's foolishness. He's talking about unbelievers. To the unbelieving, perishing world, the preaching of the message of the cross of Jesus Christ is just plain foolishness. And yet it is through that supposed foolishness that God is saving his people. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, they're going to stumble over that. To the Gentiles, that's just foolishness. But to those who are the called, Paul talks a lot about the called. In the book of Romans, it is those who are called who end up also being predestined to be conformed to the image of God's Son. And those who are predestinated are the ones who end up justified and glorified. So this concept of the called individuals is actually synonymous with Paul's language of those who are elect, those who are being saved by God. We preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, to the Gentiles foolishness, but to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God. So for the Jews who require a sign, the only sign they get is Christ. He is the power, the dunamis of God, the example, the demonstration of God. Christ is the power of God, and he is the wisdom of God. Meaning then that he is the satisfaction of everything that both Jew and Greek need in order to be satisfied with the wisdom and the power of God. They ask for signs, they ask for demonstrations of wisdom. Christ is both of those. He is the power of God, he is the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God, and by the way, that is Paul speaking in a bit of hyperbole, because there is no foolishness in God, but what he's getting at is, if you took the least little morsel of the revelation of God, the least part, the most foolish part of what God has revealed about himself, if you just take that and compare it to the wisdom of this world, God's wisdom is so far superior. His thoughts are so high above our thoughts. His ways are so high above our ways that even the least of God is so much wiser than the wisdom of this world. So the foolishness of God is wiser than mankind, and the weakness of God, same idea. Hyperbole to say the least of God's power is stronger than everything that the world can provide. Okay, so that's the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. And in that context, Paul used the phrase, the foolishness of preaching, King James. NASB, the foolishness of the message preached, because it is the message itself that the world rejects, that we hold to, by which we are being saved, and to the world, that's foolishness. So, if you are yanking out Paul's phraseology, the King James rendering of it, the foolishness of preaching, in order to act the fool while you're preaching, that would be extra foolish, because it proves that you know nothing about what the Bible actually says, nor do you understand the context in which Paul uses that phrase. So that guy did indeed prove himself to be a fool. He just didn't prove himself to be a preacher, because biblically, a preacher preaches, announces the message that Christ brought to us. So I just had to get that off my chest. I just had to tell somebody, so I decided to dial up the camera and tell you. All right, there's that. Have a good day. I appreciate you dialing us up again, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.